There was a time when anyone would tremble upon hearing the name John D. Rockefeller. Not only was he the world's first billionaire, he's one of the richest people in history. His empire, Standard Oil, became the most dominant monopoly in the world by brutally crushing competitors, taking control of multiple industries, bribing the government into submission, and treating business as if it was war. Because of his ruthless business practices and secretive deals, Rockefeller made many enemies. His career is filled with bitter rivalries, like with Andrew Carnegie, and even ferocious battles against US presidents. But before he was the titan of the oil industry, Rockefeller was at the very bottom of society. His story is one of only a handful of cases where someone manages to rise from the depth of poverty to the absolute peak of wealth and power. Rockefeller's story is at times inspiring, and at times, chilling. It's an example of what happens when greed and ambition go completely unchecked. So, let me take you back to 1839, where a young John D. Rockefeller is born into poverty.
At his peak, John D. Rockefeller was worth the equivalent of $400 billion in today's money. That makes him not just the richest American in history, but arguably the richest private individual who has ever lived on this planet. But here is what most people never talk about. He didn't build that fortune by being smarter than everyone else. He built it by making sure nobody else had a chance. This is the story of how one man took an entire industry, strangled every competitor until they had nothing left, and then convinced the world he was a saint. This is the insane truth about Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in upstate New York, into one of the most contradictory households you can imagine. His father, William Rockefeller, was a con man, not metaphorically, literally. He traveled from town to town selling fake cancer cures and pretending to be a doctor. He was charming, dishonest, and completely comfortable deceiving people for money. He even admitted to deliberately cheating his own sons in business deals, telling neighbors, quote, "I do business with my boys, and I always try to cheat them, to make them sharp." His mother was the complete opposite. Eliza was a deeply religious Baptist woman who ran the household with strict discipline, thrift, and hard work. She taught her children that willful waste makes woeful want. John absorbed both of them. He got his mother's discipline, self-control, and religious devotion, and he got his father's ruthlessness, the willingness to do whatever it takes to win. That combination would make him unstoppable. From childhood, Rockefeller was obsessed with money, not for luxury, but for what it could do. As a teenager, he raised turkeys and sold candy to classmates, carefully writing down every penny he earned and spent in a personal ledger. He didn't see money as something to enjoy. He saw it as a tool and a responsibility. He genuinely believed that God had given him the ability to make money and that it was his duty to do so. At 16, he dropped out of school and got a job as a bookkeeper. He was so good at it and so focused that by 20, he was already running his own business. And then in 1863, a new industry appeared that would change everything. Oil. America's first oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania in 1859. Within a few years, oil was everywhere. It was chaotic, disorganized, and wildly unpredictable. Prices swung violently. Quality was inconsistent, and hundreds of small operators were tripping over each other trying to get rich. Most people saw chaos. Rockefeller saw opportunity. In 1863, he invested in a Cleveland oil refinery. By 1865, he had borrowed enough money to buy out his partners and take full control. By 1870, he had founded Standard Oil Company of Ohio. And then the real game began. Rockefeller looked at the oil industry and decided that competition itself was the problem. Too many players meant unstable prices, waste, and inefficiency. His solution was simple and brutal. Eliminate the competition entirely, not by building a better product, by making it impossible for anyone else to survive. Here is how he actually did it. First, he went to the railroads, the only way to transport oil at the time, and negotiated secret deals. Because Standard Oil was shipping such enormous volumes, he convinced the railroads to give him massive discounts on shipping fees that nobody else could get. His competitors were paying full price, while Rockefeller was paying a fraction of that. But it got worse. He arranged what became known as drawbacks, where the railroads would secretly pay Rockefeller a percentage of the fees his competitors paid to ship their own oil. Think about that for a second. His rivals were paying to ship their product, and part of that money was going directly into Rockefeller's pocket. He was literally being funded by the people he was destroying. He also created artificial shortages. He would buy up all the railroad tank cars used to transport oil, so his competitors had no way to ship their product. He bought up all the available barrels, so they had nowhere to store it either. He even bought up the chemicals required to refine oil so rivals couldn't get what they needed to operate. And if none of that worked, he used predatory pricing. He would flood a specific market with oil sold at prices far below cost. Losing money deliberately, just long enough to drive local competitors into bankruptcy. Once they were dead, he'd buy their operations for almost nothing and then raise prices back up. The results were staggering. Between February and March of 1872 alone, in just 6 weeks, Rockefeller bought out 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland in what became known as the Cleveland Massacre. Competitor after competitor was given a simple choice: sell to Rockefeller or be destroyed. Most sold. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of all oil refining in America. One company, one man. The New York World newspaper at the time called Standard Oil the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that ever fastened upon a country. Rockefeller's own response to criticism about competition was 5 words. Competition, he said, is a sin. For decades, Rockefeller operated in near silence. He avoided the press. He communicated through coded messages. Standard Oil was referred to internally as Club, and Rockefeller himself was codenamed Chowder. He dodged government subpoenas by traveling secretly from place to place. He was so secretive that few people outside his inner circle even knew what he sounded like. Then a journalist named Ida Tarbell decided she had had enough. Her father had been a small oil producer who was personally destroyed by Standard Oil's tactics. She spent years methodically investigating the company and in 1902 began publishing a 19-part investigative series in McClure's magazine called The History of Standard Oil. It was one of the most thorough pieces of investigative journalism in American history. It exposed every secret deal, every railroad rebate, every manipulated market. The public was furious. Politicians who had been looking the other way suddenly had no choice but to act. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The company was broken up by force into 34 separate entities. Here is the darkest punchline of the whole story. When Rockefeller heard the news while playing golf that Standard Oil would be broken up, he calmly turned to his playing partner and told him to buy Standard Oil stock while it was cheap, because he knew that the broken up pieces would each be worth more than the whole. He was right. His personal fortune actually increased after the breakup. Those 34 companies became some of the largest corporations in the world. Today, ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP's American operations, ConocoPhillips, all of them trace directly back to Standard Oil. By the early 1900s, Rockefeller was the most hated man in America. Newspapers attacked him daily. Politicians used his name as a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked corporate power. He received death threats. He was accused of bribing politicians, spying on rivals, and crushing thousands of small businessmen into nothing. So, what did he do? He reinvented himself through charity on a scale the world had never seen. He founded the University of Chicago. He created the Rockefeller Foundation. He poured hundreds of millions of dollars into public health programs that helped eradicate diseases across the American South and beyond. He handed out dimes to children wherever he went. A carefully crafted image of generosity that photographers loved. By the time he died in 1937, at the age of 97, having given away over $500 million, the equivalent of billions today, much of the public had forgotten the Cleveland Massacre, the railroad drawbacks, and the thousands of businesses he had quietly strangled out of existence. They remembered the generous old man with the dimes. Here's what you are left with after the whole story. A man born to a con artist father who learned deception as a child. A deeply religious man who convinced himself that destroying his competitors was God's work. The most ruthless monopolist in American history, who then became one of the greatest philanthropists the world has ever seen. Was Rockefeller a villain or a visionary? The honest answer is, he was both. At the same time, in equal measure, what is not debatable is this. The companies his empire was broken into still supply the oil that powers most of the world today. His shadow is still everywhere. You just can't see it anymore. If this story made you think, subscribe, because the next one is just as deep.